As you may know, almost all of the places, people, nations, and battles featured in one of my favorite television series, Game of Thrones, and its book equivalent, A Song of Ice and Fire, are based off of real locations, events, and noteworthy personalities from throughout history, with some being exaggerated, some being twisted and swapped, and others being so highly analogous to the point that they almost seem like a parody of the wacky, deranged reality we call our own. Excluding the dragons, ice zombies, magic, and other otherworldly creatures, the Game of Thrones universe is pretty well grounded in reality, with wars, battles, disease, starvation, and all the other plights that have plagued humanity throughout history, and even in the present day. Author George R.R. Martin has expressed his interest in real-world history several times in the past, especially that of feudal England during the medieval period, and the style and tone of the television series obviously draws its backdrops, royalty, technology, and atmosphere from that specific place and time, and Martin was also certain to draw inspiration from other areas of the globe as well. From the culture, customs, and religions of the inhabitants of this fictional land, to the strangely obsessive focus on ancestral relationships and the nobility, to the pervasiveness of slavery, murder, rape, crime, and other injustices in the countryside, to even the various battles and massacres featured in the series, it would seem that the old adage of "there's nothing new under the sun," or "there's no such thing as a new idea" holds true, and the majority of the series merely borrows from previous works as well as real life. If you want to see a comparison linking the various rulers and battles of Game of Thrones to real-world events, there are plenty of videos out there doing a steadfast analysis, but in today's video we will be discussing the demography and geography of the very extensive fantasy world built by Martin that has seemingly taken the entire world by storm, gathering more interest than nearly any fantasy world ever conjured up by a single man. I know this is a bit different from my normal content, but ever since I started watching this show as a teenager, I couldn't help but point out these similarities to friends and family with about the same reaction as you'd expect. So first of all, we need to point out something that most people already know, which is that the fictional continent of Westeros is clearly analogous to the British Isles, as the map is literally just Ireland flipped upside down with Scotland on top and a few other extraneous bits added onto that, which people have been pointing out for years now. And in the series, Westeros does have many similarities to Great Britain, although it's not entirely comparable as it has traits from continental Europe also thrown in there in terms of demographic and historic events. The continent of Essos in the show is more of a representation of mainland Eurasia, stretching from France, Italy, Central Asia, and even the Far East, and this may or may not have been intentional, but it does appear to be quite similar in shape to the peninsula of Anatolia in Southwest Asia, and what is modern-day Turkey. In the Game of Thrones universe, the technology and political ideology appear to be most in alignment with Europe around 900 AD, when the many kingdoms of England were unified under a single crown, as Westeros is also an example of a recently unified kingdom with many different leaders squabbling for power. Similarly, it is acknowledged by some in the show that the original inhabitants of the continent of Westeros were the fantastic races known as the Children of the Forest, who are basically elves or pixies, and the Westerosi giants, who could be interpreted as either a manifestation of nature itself or the inhabitants of the British Isles before the arrival of Indo-Europeans, as there were almost certainly people living in this region before the modern ethnic groups we see today arrived, since roughly 10,000 BC. The first humans to migrate to the lands of Westeros are called, well, the first men, and are very obviously supposed to be parallel to the Celtic tribes such as the Picts or Gaels, and they belong to an entirely different ethno-linguistic group from the next group to migrate to this massive island called the Andals, originating in Essos, or the mainland of Europe, very clearly analogous to the Germanic tribes that invaded the British Isles and gave birth to the Anglo-Saxons that displaced the Celts. With Westeros divided between several different provinces, this is comparable to that in medieval England, although with slightly more autonomy and way larger areas. And some of the more noteworthy provinces in the media include the area known simply as the North, which is where the story begins in both the show and books. The Northmen are a strange amalgamation of the Scottish and Irish, living in more rugged, colder, and harsher environments previously shunned by great powers, but ever since their incorporation are all the more stubborn, independently minded, and are increasingly pushing for separatism, as the Northmen are descendants of the first men, seeing themselves as a separate nation, illegitimately annexed by a more powerful southern adversary. Starting to see the similarities? At the northern border of the Seven Kingdoms is what's referred to simply as the Wall in the show, and this separates the more civilized realms from the savages and unknown of what lies even further north, a set piece which even Martin himself has admitted is inspired by Hadrian's Wall in Great Britain, which previously separated the colonized area of Roman Britain from the Celtic tribes in modern Scotland. So although many of the time periods and geographic regions are a bit scrambled, it's still very clear to see the equivalencies. The capital of the Seven Kingdoms, King's Landing, could be representative of either London, Paris, Rome, Constantinople, or another large capital city of an old empire, and its architecture and setting, in the show at least, is more similar to that of ancient Rome. Near the northern province of the north lies the collective known as the Iron Islands, who have a reputation in the show of being obnoxiously aggressive and not only a major nuisance to the other kingdoms, but a major threat to civilians living in coastal areas of the mainland, as the islanders have been known in the past and the present to invade, pillage, and rape entire towns, an obvious nod to the Vikings of Scandinavia, and their attire and culture in the show reflects this. One last interesting part of the Seven Kingdoms is the Kingdom of Dorne, and the Dornish are located on a jutting peninsula in the far south, just as the Cornish in the British Isles are, although the Dornish are unique for being descended from foreigners further east in the continent of Essos, who in the media were forced to flee their homeland when invaded by a much stronger power known as the Valyrians. More on that later. Allegedly, the Dornish traveled and attempted to settle all over Essos before arriving in Dorne, so similarities can be drawn to the Jews, who were also exiled from their homeland by the Roman Empire and scattered all over the Mediterranean, although the Jews never settled entirely in one region and never created their own diasporic kingdom, such as the Dornish. This could also be analogous to Spain and Iberia as a whole, as these countries arose after the peninsula was invaded by a foreign power, and the vast majority of Dornishmen cast on the show are of Southern European, Latino, or multiracial descent. The Valyrians are definitely supposed to be Game of Thrones' version of the Roman Empire, centered on a peninsula, and despite originating as a small power, defied all odds to become one of the greatest civilizations the world had ever seen in only a short time period, although in the show it's due to the military superiority of dragons. In the media, the Valyrians were wiped out before the events of the series by the destruction of their homeland on the Valyrian Peninsula by a series of volcanic cataclysms, drawing inspiration from the complete annihilation of the city of Pompeii on the Italian peninsula. And although in real life the Roman Empire didn't collapse from one single destructive event, the books merely spiced things up a bit by adding dragons and supervolcanoes and rock zombies. The conquest of Westeros by the Targaryens, who were essentially Valyrian refugees, can somewhat be drawn to the Norman invasion and conquest of England, with the ruling nobility of Norman origin generally disliked by the public at large, being seen as foreign conquerors. Elsewhere in the world created by Martin, there are more interesting comparisons to be made, such as the Dothraki living in the eastern portion of Essos, who are given special attention and detail in the show, being displayed as savage, brutal, although somewhat reckless without a greater desire or skill in conquering and holding on to territory, who are most likely an amalgamation of the Mongols, Huns, Turks, and other nomads of Eurasia, although in the show are mostly portrayed by Middle Eastern or South Asian actors. Further east are the so-called Bone Mountains, which may be a representation of the Ural Mountains, which are generally accepted to be the geographic division between Europe and Asia, despite being connected on the same landmass, and to the east of these is the Empire of Yi Ti, which by its name alone is obviously a tribute to ancient China, described as one of the greatest empires ever seen, with cities dwarfing that in Westeros, although this hasn't really been portrayed in the show. To the southwest of this great kingdom is the region of Gis, inhabited by the Giscari, who were some of the first to be conquered by the Valyrians in the southwestern part of Essos, and can be interpreted as either the Greeks or an ancient Middle Eastern power such as the Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, or Medes. And from what I can gather from the show, slavery is a huge part of their economy and culture, further drawing parallels. Even further to the southwest of this civilization and south of Westeros is what are called the Summer Isles, with people from this region being cast by those of African descent in the show. And although there aren't any large African islands in the vicinity of Europe or the Middle East in the real world, the Summer Isles are probably inspired by the Swahili coast and its people, as the people of the Isles, just like the Swahili, were primarily slavers and traders before someone put a stop to it for good. In addition, there's also the continent of Sothorios mentioned in the novels, clearly a nod to Africa, described as an inhospitable, mysterious jungle climate with many diseases, creatures, and dangers, which would have been the perception of sub-Saharan Africa to medieval Europeans, and it is said that almost all outsiders who attempt settlement on the continent would be dead from disease in less than a year, and in the 1800s, European troops and officials stationed in Africa would also be lucky to survive even 6 months. So, if anything, this shows the absolute brilliance of George R.R. Martin to reincorporate elements of history and demography of the real world into this fantastic realm of beasts, magic, and incredible journey in such a way that we can suspend our disbelief for long enough to finish a chapter of a novel or an hour-long television episode. It also shows that life truly is indeed stranger than fiction, and even if some of the parallels I drew in this video were unintentional, you really can't beat reality in terms of uniqueness and bizarre occurrences. And that fact truly makes it a lot easier to digest that when you're watching the show or reading the novels, the entire world you're discovering was pieced together by just one guy. So please let me know your thoughts on the real-life inspiration for the media tens of millions of people worldwide have enjoyed. And for today's poll, tell me which area of Game of Thrones is the most interesting to you. And as always, this has been Mason. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.